Well, welcome back to our VITA tax law training. In our last session, we went over how to create an account in Practice Lab and then the actual mechanics of preparing a tax return using the TaxSlayer software program in Practice Lab. In this session, we're going to go over the intake and quality review process, talk about filing status and who should file returns. Now, you may have watched the Getting Started Link and Learn tutorial uh, video, and you may have even taken the intake and quality review exam. However, this lecture is going to be about boots on the ground conducting an interview and what are the things you should ask of these taxpayers to make sure we get all the information to prepare an accurate return. So let's get started with this. Okay. So I'd like to begin to thinking, a lot of people laugh at me, especially my wife, when I talk about taxes are really fun. They're like puzzles to solve. And, maybe it's not fun doing your own taxes, especially if you end up owing something, but when you're doing it for others and you can generate a big refund for them and you really become somewhat of an expert of this, it, it, it really is fun. And you're really helping people out here. Most tax returns, they might appear complicated, but they're really not. More of it is understanding what you're looking at and putting it into the software correctly and learning what to expect out of it. Hey, we even have high school students preparing tax returns at Metro Tech High School in Phoenix. So this is session 2. And usually this would be the session that we do in a live face-to-face training. I'm going to break this up into 2 sections. We're going to start here with the intake and quality review. We're going to ask you to take the intake test if you haven't already taken it. Do that as homework. We'll talk about filing status and who must file, who should file. And then in the second session, we'll talk about dependents and income. So, intake and quality review. All of our whole goal of the tax return is to do an accurate return, get these folks all the money they're entitled to coming back, but then make sure that they don't get in trouble for, preparing a wrong return. We want an accurate return. And to do that, we've got to be able to pull information out of these folks. We've got to kind of be psychologists in a way in talking with them. So that form 13614C, that's the intake and interview quality review sheet. That's the tool that we're going to use to be able to elicit all of this information. There's even, the IRS even has, remember what a QSR is, a quality site requirement? That requires us to use this intake form throughout the whole preparation of the return. We must use it. I will put a link to that form at the bottom in the information part of this interview, because we're going to go over that form in detail in a second here. So what are some of the resources? Will be that form. We've already talked about the publication 4012, the Volunteer Resource Guide. If you're a new volunteer, you should have gotten a hard copy of that. If not, you can download one. And I'm going to ask you to keep that handy. I'm going to ask you to refer to that as we go through this presentation here. This is the intake and quality review sheet. As I said, there'll be a link to where you can open one up in that. And we're going to talk about the different parts of this. In fact, you'll see these little numbers here to where in the succeeding slides, we actually talk about these sections of it. So in the first section right here is, what are you going to need here for section 1? You're going to need tax forms, social security cards, a picture ID for doing that. We're asking the taxpayer, this is a 6-page form, and we're asking the taxpayer to complete all of that, but then we have to go over with them an interview and make sure that they've covered everything, that they haven't forgotten stuff. So the first place we talk about is putting in their name. Now you think, okay, well, that's pretty simple, right? It's not. We put in names and we're finding we have a lot of people especially people from China or Mexico or, well, all over the world, in fact, they come here and they're filing tax returns. And it's not just the same as many of us might think. Well, I might think, hell, I got a first name, middle initial, last name. Got a middle name, but hardly ever tell anybody that. But that's just not the case for most of these people. Sometimes we get social security cards and there's like 6 names on it. Well, where do I put those? There's only 3 fields in here, say first name, middle name, and last name. And so, for common ones, well, this is pretty simple. We could do this. Now, where am I finding this information? This is going to be in your 4012. Right down here, I think I've got information. The 1-3, it's in the 4012 tab B, pages 6 through 10. So you should open that up right now and be looking through that. Because on the next page, now here we get a lot of other foreign names that, well, hey, what's the first name? What's the last name? We're not really sure. But in that tab B of your publication 4012, it gives you some hints. For instance, you have one here that says Juan de la Rosa y Obregón, right? Well, Juan, well, okay, that's the first name, but then what do we do? Is de la, we just ignore that and put this as a middle name anyway. You get the idea where it could be confusing. And they're suggesting you put in Juan as the first name, and then the whole rest of it is the last name field. Same thing, you can kind of get an idea. I run a site at Scottsdale Community College, which is on a Native American reservation, and we get names sometimes like this. Well, and even the Social Security card doesn't really define it for you. However, I will tell you the newer ones, when you see the Social Security card, it'll be names are on 2 lines. The second line is usually what you put in the last name field. So that'll do it. Why is this so important? Is we get when we file a return electronically, they're checking it with the Social Security database, and if the names don't match up, it just rejects. And we have to go figure out what we do wrong with the names. Another hint I would tell you is we always ask the taxpayers to bring their last year's tax return. And if that was electronically filed, then we know we should put in the name exactly as it was on the last year's tax return. Okay. Here are some Asian names too that can be just as confusing too. So this gives you, again, this is in tab B of your 4012, pages 6 through 12. Okay. So here's the mailing address. Now, the mailing address should be where they would mail a refund, or more importantly, where they would mail correspondence if they've got a question about the return. You probably heard a lot of things about scams and people getting emails and text messages. IRS doesn't send emails and text messages. If they've got a question, they're going to mail you a letter. They don't call you. So we want to make sure this address is going to be one where they're getting their mail. Okay. This section right here, where it says 5, this is important, right? If they're not a U.S. citizen, go look at tab L of your 4012. And that's going to give you a little chart to determine whether they're a resident or a non-resident alien. And that's going to help us determine whether the return is in scope. Also, if they're a full-time student, because if they're a full-time student, then there's different rules about whether they can be claimed as a dependent, which we're going to go over in the next session. 6 right here. Why is it important if they're legally blind? And you've probably known people that, well, they can see a little bit, but are they legally blind? Actually, we've got tab R of the 4012 will kind of give you a definition. And it's basically if they've got a doctor's statement that says they're legally blind. Why is that important? In a few minutes, you're going to learn that they'll get a larger standard deduction if they are. Why is it important if they're permanently disabled? That may qualify them for, or qualify them to be eligible for an earned income tax credit, even if they don't meet other requirements. What else says here? It says see tab P if the taxpayer is a victim of identity theft or they applied for or received an IP PIN. What's an IP PIN? Identity Protection Personal Identification Number. And if there's been a report of an ID stolen that IRS got a report of, they sent the taxpayer a letter saying, hey, we've assigned you an IP PIN and we won't accept a return if it doesn't have this IP PIN number. You know, some folks, they don't understand that letter. They think, well, I didn't lose my driver's license. I don't know why I'm getting this. And they toss it. And they come into us and there's a question on the form. Well, right up there, did you have an IP PIN issued to you? Right there. Issued an identity PIN? That's a real important question. Out of rejects last year, we got two major rejects. One was for Obamacare and the other was for IP PINs because people just threw that letter away or they didn't think it applied to them or whatever. Another thing that'll happen is last year or 2 years ago, IRS opened it up to where even if you haven't had identity theft, you can apply for an IP PIN. And once you apply for it, then it stays in place, I think for 5 years or until you do it, until you write them and say, I don't want it anymore. And then the first year they send you a letter, but then the second year you have to go on to your irs.gov account to get that. And some people forget it. I forgot that. I applied for one, got a letter the first year. Second year came, I'd forgotten all about it. I filed my personal return and it rejected. And and I had to go on to irs.gov and get my IP PIN. So this is very important. There's another question up here about digital assets. Where is it? Oh, right here. Owners or holders of digital assets, right? And digital assets are out of scope for VITA, meaning we cannot do returns where they bought or sold digital assets. If they only bought them, right, like for doing it, but if they cashed them in or traded it in for dollars, then there's a gain or a loss and we can't do it. Yeah, so here's more detail on digital assets, right? And taxpayer, so they're not going to understand this. Okay, they're going to say, what do you mean by digital assets? And you're going to say, well, crypto. Did you do any transactions with crypto? Oh yeah, I was playing around with that. I heard you could make a lot of money with it, and and then we can't do the return, right? But the taxpayers are going to click no if they held no digital assets for the tax years, or if their only transactions were the purchase of digital assets. If you just buy crypto, that doesn't cause a taxable transaction. It's when you convert it back to dollars that it does that. If they only just held the digital asset in a wallet or account, they didn't trade it, that's okay. We can do the return then. If they just transferred from wallet or account to another, and again, they didn't convert it to dollars, or if they receive the digital asset as an inheritance or gift. So if they click no or they leave this blank, we've got to ask them. We've got to ask them about it and try to explain to them what goes on. 8 says, if you have a balance due, how would you like to make your payment, right? And again, in your 4012, tab K is going to show you about how to enter information about a refund or a balance due. Now, here's another one that we're seeing more of right here. Would you like to receive written communication from the IRS in a language other than English? And we do serve a lot of Hispanic taxpayers, and we should ask them. They may even leave this blank, but it's up to you to see if they want the written communication in a different language. Okay. Number 10, and I think I mentioned this in the last video. I've been preparing taxes for 30 years. This question has always been on the tax return. Would you like it? When I first started, it was $1 to go to the presidential election campaign fund. I've never seen anybody check that yes. Although it's not affecting their taxes, well, okay, different story, but I've never seen it checked yes. However, I noticed in the returns that you're going to be doing in the intake and interview forms, I think they're all marked yes. It doesn't really affect the tax return, and you're not going to get an answer wrong if you mark it no or not, but it's in one of those questions I showed you in the last video, right under the address. There's all of these questions right there that you should mark the box if it was applied to the tax return. Okay. Number 11, okay, it's asking about their marital status, and sometimes they may have gotten married or divorced within the year, and you probably need to ask them some questions about that, especially if they have dependents. But, well, even more so, if they got divorced during the year, well, I guess that won't really matter, but we're going to talk about filing status a little bit later on, and you're going to understand why some of these questions might matter. But the 4012 has got a section on marital status that can explain to you why it might affect, especially if they're getting Obamacare or something like that. So you should review that. Number 12, it says, and notice, see these gray areas that are on the intake and interview form? If it's a gray area, we as the preparer, we're supposed to answer that. So we're supposed to ask them, can anybody else claim you on their return? If they're an elderly person, maybe they live with their son or daughter, and maybe their son or daughter could claim them. Or if they're a student, maybe they are even away at college. Their parents may be able to claim them on their return. So we're going to learn a little bit more about that in the dependent section in the next section. But you should be aware to ask this question and ask them, and we'll give you some more details of what to ask later. Then in this bottom section down here, right, we're asking them to list everybody who lived with you. Now, be careful. People are going to read this really quick and they're going to think, oh, they're asking for dependents. Oh yeah, I got a daughter, but they're claiming themselves. I'm not claiming them. Yeah, they live with me, but they're filing their own return. Well, we're asking them this because sometimes they should or should not be claiming them as dependents. Maybe their parents live with them, and maybe we can get them more of a refund by claiming their parents. Maybe we even need to change their parents' return. Maybe they did file their own return and claim themselves, but they didn't need to. So we're asking them to just put everybody who lived with you, and then see in this gray area, this is when we mark these questions down here, that's going to help us determine whether they can be claimed as a dependent or not. Always include this note. There's some blank sections there on page 5 if you need it to list additional names, or put notes on there about your questions for that. Verify the birth date, but verify all of this information, okay? Now, 15, right, says number of months that they lived in your home. We're going to go over this when we talk about dependencies, but there's times that, like, the common one here is you got a student and they went away to college. Well, that's called a temporary absence. Or you got a parent and they were in the hospital for, a long time. Or better yet, they live in assisted living and you're maybe paying the bills for that. Well, you get to still claim them as a dependent. So we need to be able to ask them this information too. 16 says if they're not a U.S. citizen, we should look at tab L, because also if they they live in Mexico or Canada, we can still sometimes claim them as dependents too. I already talked about the ITINs, right? This section right here, 17. Okay, this is page 2. And in general, this is where they're going to list about their income and mainly here, this one's more about their income. Okay. And I think this is the upper half of page 2. The important part about this is see this gray area right here? They're going to fill out the white area here. And they'll probably leave a bunch of this stuff blank. We still need to go over every single one and we need to ask them about it. And we need to either they'll mark W-2s. And okay, this is, they give you one W-2. We need to ask, was this the only job you had? Oh yeah, I forgot about that temporary one I worked over Christmas at Target, for that. We need to ask them about that. Here it'll say tips, right? Not all tips are reported on a W-2. Maybe they're an Uber driver and they got some cash tips. And if they tell us about that, we have to put it on the return. We'll talk about that. But let me talk about these. What are these little B's and A's here that are talking about? These are certification levels. And so we look at tips right here. It says B/A. Well, which is it? Well, tips, it's basic if it was reported on a W-2. Then we know exactly what their tips. And we say, well, look, did you have any other tips? No, I claimed them all to my employer and he put them on the W-2. Good. If you're basic certified, you can do that return. Okay. If there's tips that are not reported on a W-2, you have to be certified at the advanced level. So that's what these little annotations are. For instance, if they sold stocks or bonds, you have to have advanced certification to go over that. Okay, so all of these things we're going to talk about in detail for what you're to do. But the main important part is that you go through and you confirm all of this stuff. And you've got to put a little check or notes in here that, so the reviewer can see that you really discuss this with them so that we get an accurate return done. Okay. This is the bottom part of this. Oh, wait, no, this is the top part. This is the detail of the top part that I just was going over. Okay. I don't want to spend any more time than I really should here. I think I've already discussed what you need to know about this. Okay. I think that this is page 3, and this is where they're talking about deductions. Okay. Taxpayers can either take a standard deduction, which is a set amount that's given to them that's defined by their filing status, their age, whether they're blind or not. And it's a set amount that you don't have to prove anything. They give you that deduction just for, breathing air. Okay. If they have deductions things like charitable contributions or medical expenses, taxes that they paid, things like that then they could, if they're come to more than the standard deduction, they can itemize it. So if they're marking down here that they had mortgage interest or this, we need to draw out of them how much that they had. And sometimes I tell my preparers, when they bring you all of these documents, they're thinking they've been collecting these because they can itemize deductions. And you may know that, hey, they're probably not going to itemize. They're going to take the standard deduction. But we still tell them, just go ahead and put it all in anyway. Let the tax software determine whether they're taking the standard deduction or itemized deductions. But here's where we need to ask them information about this too. Student loan interest. Oh, did they have child and dependent care expenses or make contributions to a retirement account? Again, we need to ask them about this and check off here, put a little check mark that we've asked them about it or put notes about it. Maybe they say, yeah, I made contributions to it, but hey, it was to a Roth account. Well, it's not going to affect the tax return, but let's just make a note here. They made contributions to a Roth account. Okay. Oh, did you have educational expenses? We get this a lot. And this becomes kind of a complicated part. Okay. We'll talk a lot more about that when we get to deductions too, and credits. What else is on here? Oh, did they install energy efficient items? There's where we'll have to get a lot more detail. And we're going to tell you in a little bit that you should go through this interview and determine these things before you even really start the return, because you may find that the return's out of scope and we can't help them. So it's no sense getting the whole return done. You get right down to the end, they say, oh yeah, I forgot about this solar panel I installed. Oh, really? Well, we can't do the return if you installed solar panels, right? So, and then they're upset. You just spent an hour with them. You did a whole lot of work for nothing. So it's best for all of this stuff to come out right at the beginning. Okay. Page 4 talks about demographic information, and it's optional. They do not have to fill this out, or they can mark prefer not to answer. Remember, I showed you in the last session that screen where we can put in all of this information. It helps for grant purposes, and IRS likes to know what communities they're serving and how this program's helping out. Okay. Page 5 has additional lines where you can put all kinds of notes in there, and you should use those. Even though we're going to give this form back to the taxpayer, hopefully they're going to bring their package next year, and then there'll be some notes that'll save you a little bit of work. Or it helps the quality reviewer figure out why you determine something a certain way or not. Unchecked boxes have to be addressed with the taxpayer, and you annotate no, or I said use a check mark. Probably better to put no or not applicable. NA if something doesn't matter. As you discuss each of the questions, make sure that the answers they give you correlate with the documents, right? They've given you a 1099 miscellaneous because they were an Uber driver that said, okay, here were their declared tips, here were their fees and stuff like that. But then in the interview, they said, well, yeah, I had some other cash tips that didn't get reported on that. So then we know we need to go do something different. This says here, methods for completing that could vary from site to site, but in most places, we give them that form, we have them sit down, they fill out the form. Some sites may have a screener then that goes over the form with them, looks at their documents, because maybe they're missing some information and we send them away before they even get to you. But most sites probably have you going over this with the taxpayer. And it really kind of helps. As a preparer, I would prefer to do that, so I know I'm putting stuff in correctly. Okay. I had mentioned before that one of the quality site requirements is that we must use this form for all returns being prepared. Okay. And we help the taxpayer. That, a lot of the taxpayers, they don't understand all of those questions, so we're there to help them with it. Usually at our sites, we'll have versions of the form both in Spanish and English, but there are online versions we can download and print out of a plethora of languages too. I'm going to back up here a little bit. There's also an electronic fillable form, and more of our sites are trying to get our clients to schedule their appointments online, and then we usually give them links to this so that maybe they can be doing some of this work before they get there. So I said this before, don't begin entering the taxpayer information until you go through the whole review, because you might find that you're only certified at one level and they need to be certified. You need to have a preparer that's certified at a different level, or they don't have all the information or documentation, or you find out they're married filing jointly, but their wife didn't come. They both have to be there to sign the return. There's no sense starting the return and then telling them, oh, sorry, we can't do it. Or more importantly, this third one is that we can't do the return at all. And they sat there, they filled out, done all this work. They're expecting their return to be done, and then you send them away and tell them they have to go to a paid preparer. Then they're mad. The earlier we can figure that out, the better. Okay, good. So during this interview process, it's more than just looking at that form and filling it out. Here's where I told you had to be a bit of a psychologist, right? We got to ask clarifying questions. We get this interview form. It says, oh yeah, I got a 1099 NEC, right? And we're going to talk about what those are. I know you don't know about what those are now, but when we see that, boy, there's a lot of other information we need to gather from them. Okay, let's look at other things too. Okay, it says, I see that no one else lives in your home. And then they might respond, well, yeah, my mom moved in with me, but she's not filing a return. And, or she is filing a return. I'm not claiming her as a dependent, right? Well, we need to know about that. Maybe they say, you'll hear me use this example of, your old high school buddy, Kevin, he needed a place to crash and it turned into be 6 months, right? He's sleeping on your couch. Well, hey, there may be a tax benefit in there for you, right? But they don't think of things like that. So ask them. And, so they hand you one form, a 1099-R as a pension income. Oh, I see you only had income from your pension. Oh, well, no, I worked this little part-time job, or, I worked, I kind of had a little side business mowing lawns, but nobody gave me a 1099 for that, so I don't have to claim that, right? No, that's not really right. Or, here's another one. So no one else can claim you as a dependent. You get the student who comes in there, they're in college, they worked, they're filing a return, they're doing the right things. But hey, it turns out that they're 22 and they're still living at home because they're still in college, right? And maybe dad gets to claim them as a dependent. So we need to find out those things. Be alert for conflicting information. Sometimes an entry on one part will raise a question on another part. For example, oh, I see that you and your husband both worked, yet you did not indicate that you paid any child care expenses for your 3-year-old son. Well, that may be true. And they respond, well, yeah, my grandma took care of him, right? But they said, oh, that they may say, I can get a deduction for that. And actually, there's a big credit that they can get for that. So we want to get that information out of it. Or second one, I see that you're over the age of 65, but you did not indicate that you receive Social Security benefits. And they may say, well, yeah, they didn't send me a form for that. And they did. They probably didn't understand what it was. Or they may say, no, I'm waiting until I'm 70 so I can get a bigger check, right? So we just need to clarify those kinds of things. Okay, I see that you answered no to the question, can anyone claim you on their tax return? However, you're a full-time student and you live with your parents, right? It depends. If they're over 24, then yeah. Well, even then, I shouldn't say that. We'll cover those things when we get to the dependent section. So what's the purpose of the quality review is we want to do an accurate return. We want to make sure we capture everything that's on that intake and interview form. We want to be sure all the documents that we got everything, that they didn't, lose them or miss them or something. We use the interview with the taxpayer to make sure, and then we want to, the quality reviewer is going to make sure that everything that was input into the software. So we use all of this stuff goes into the intake interview and this interview form, the source documents. All of this feeds into the quality reviewer. The quality reviewer is going to look at the tax return and make sure that, yeah, even though we input this stuff, did it show up right on the tax return? Oh, okay. So again, I just really want to emphasize this. We're trying to prepare accurate returns. This is kind of giving some statistics of reviews that IRS does. SPEC stands for Stakeholder Partnership, Education, and Communication. This is the branch of IRS that oversees VITA and TCE, right? And they do reviews. They do different types of review. One type of review they did found we did 97% of our returns accurately. Another one said it was almost 99%. We do a pretty good job of this. I worked in large CPA firms, and I will tell you, we do a better job than they do. Some of them work very high-end quality clients and have very complex returns, but the simple returns, we do a more thorough job than even they do. So, okay, let's talk about scope of service. Scope means what are you doing returns that are within the scope of the VITA program. There are certain things that are out of scope that we can't do. And the IRS provides us a list of those things that returns that we can or cannot prepare. And what's important about this to you is that as long as you do only those things that we've been trained to, meaning they're within the scope of the VITA program, then you're protected by the Volunteer Protection Act, meaning you can't be sued, just even though you made a mistake. Okay, so that's really important. Okay, how do you find out what's out of scope? Well, the first place is in your Pub 4012, and there's a bunch of pages, 6 to 21, Roman numeral case, and it's all listed by form. Even I find it difficult. Oh, I want to find out if this energy credit is out of scope, but I got to know what form the energy credit is reported on. Now I can go Google that and probably find it out. And there's a lot of these that are out of scope, but most partners, meaning spec partners, organizations that run VITA sites, they will give you a list of the more common ones. Sometimes you find little ones, like I happen to know that on a 1099-R, which is a form that you report pension distributions, right? And there's little codes on there. And I know that there's some codes on there that we can't do. It's like a code J, and I can go look in the 4012 and see, well, that's like a Roth distribution that was premature or whatever. And I don't know, thing says, can we do that? Then I can go into these pages and I can go look under form 1099-R, and it'll tell me which codes are out of scope. Better though, like here is a form that we use at City of Phoenix, and most partners have this kind of form because these are the more common ones. First of all, Bitcoin or cryptocurrency, out of scope, can't do it. If their income exceeds 67,000. Now, if it's just a little bit over, or it's like a one-time thing, go talk to your site coordinator. Maybe there's a way we can do the return. We do not do married filing separate returns, period. Okay, just stop right then, and if the taxpayer is getting aggravated, oh, I always do this or whatever, then go have the site coordinator step in and talk to them. If they're doing a business return and they got a loss on the business return, meaning they have more expenses than they have income, we can't do the return. Or down here, if their total of their expenses are more than 35,000, we can't do it. Here's another big one, non-cash donations of more than 500. Now, granted, we're working with low-income folks, and most of them aren't giving away lots of stuff that are real valuable, but they may have moved, and they may give a garage full of stuff to Goodwill, and it's worth more than 500. But we can't do that. That requires a special form with a lot of extra information on it, and it's out of scope. There's a whole variety of others. I'm not going to talk about them, but here's one that says rental income, and it's got a little asterisk there. Well, there are other VITA sites that have trained volunteers to handle these situations. Now, I will generally tell you, rental income is only if you're military certified and you're working with military personnel who've been stationed someplace else that had to rent out their home, right? Then we can do it. Main reason for that is, here's another one, it says depreciation. Depreciation is when you buy an asset for a business or a rental like the house, or you buy a piece of equipment for your business, that the expense gets spread out over multiple years. We can't do those returns. Okay, so those are things that are out of scope. Okay, so now that we've gone through this, if you haven't already, before our next session, go into Link and Learn and take that intake and interview and quality review test. It's fairly simple, won't be hard for you to take, okay? So let's now go through who must file, who must file and who should file, okay? So here's a chart. This is on your Pub 4012. Go ahead and open it up because there's going to be some questions later. Under tab A1, this is kind of a snapshot of it, but let me kind of give you the overview of this, okay? So earlier on, I talked about there's the standard deduction and itemized deductions. Everybody is allowed at least the standard deduction, and it's a set amount that is determined by your filing status, how old you are, and whether you were blind or not. And so therefore, that's a deduction. So let's say you have 10,000 of income and you have $14,600 as your standard deduction. Well, then what's your taxable income? It's negative. Well, it's zero. It never becomes negative. So if it's zero, if your income isn't more than the standard deduction, they don't make you file a return. You don't even have to file. Now, in VITA, we encourage everyone to file a return. It protects their identity so nobody grabs their social security number and files it. We also find a lot of seniors that are really pretty much living on social security, or they may have a little part-time job for doing that. Well, they can get a property tax credit, right? So we want them to file a return. But anyway, here's this chart. And it says, look, if your filing status is single, and by the way, we're going to go over filing status here in a bit, so you'll learn how to be able to determine this, okay? If you're under 65, well, there's a standard deduction, and that means if your income is less than that, you don't have to file a return. If you're 65 or older, you get a larger standard deduction. Same thing with these different filing statuses, okay? So who must file a return? Again, it depends on your filing status, age, gross income. And then also we want to ask if they can be claimed as a dependent on another return, okay? Because that has a whole separate, different set of rules if they're a dependent and they have income. Most of that's going to be out of scope though, if they've got a lot of income, okay? So taxpayers exceeding the income that we just told you about that's in that chart on page A1, they have to file. But here's something else. People with net self-employment earnings of 400 or more. Now, what does that mean, net? It means you take your income minus your expenses, and if what's left, that's your net income from self-employment. If it's 400 or more, then they owe self-employment taxes on that. So even if they don't owe income taxes, even if their standard deduction wipes out all of this income, if it's net income of 400 or more, they're going to owe self-employment taxes. So they have to file a return. If they receive a disbursement from an HSA, that's a health savings account, and there'll be a form, 5498, and they get that form. If they've got that form, they've got to file a return too. If they got advance payments of the premium tax credit, you say, what's the premium tax credit? This is Obamacare or the Affordable Care Act. And if in other words, the advance payments are a subsidy of their health insurance premiums. And those caused us a lot of rejects last year because people didn't bring us those forms, and they answered the question on there said, did you have insurance under the Affordable Care Act? They don't even know what that meant. If we said, did you get insurance through the marketplace or Obamacare? Oh yeah, so there again, in that interview, you need to be asking those questions about that. If they're using married filing separately, we do not do the return. Some of them will come and say, well, they did it before at a VITA site. Well, if they did, they shouldn't have, and we're not going to do it. Okay, there's a lot of reasons for that. Through the course of this, I'll kind of come across some of those for you. Who should file? So maybe they don't have to file a return, I gave you one example that somebody who only was earning Social Security, and if they get Social Security and don't have much other income, they don't have to file a return. But we might can get them $512 back from Arizona by filing that return. Okay. Anytime you had income tax withheld from your pay, you should file a return to get it back. Or if you made estimated payments, those are quarterly estimated payments that you make. Most of our clients don't do that. You don't see that much. But you might qualify for credits like the earned income credit, child tax credit, education credits. Health coverage is the Obamacare one, right? You should file a tax return. Again, I mentioned that a federal return may be required for some Arizona credits. And here's the biggest one in bold. It makes sure nobody files a return with your Social Security number on it. That's really what's important. They're all important, but that can really cause you a lot of problems. And we've seen them coming into our sites that, and it's a mess. Okay, still not sure? You could use something, there's a tool at the irs.gov that's called the Interactive Tax Assistance. And the way you do it is you go right to irs.gov and right on the main page, you can say here, get answers to your tax questions. When you click on that, it brings you to the Interactive Tax Assistance, and you can type in here, can grandma be claimed as a dependent, right? And it's going to start asking you questions about the dependency thing. And as you answer the questions, it'll then give you an answer. And sometimes I'll use this tool and go through it all. It gives you the answer. I print it out and I put it with their tax return. Because sometimes, you think it's really simple, or most people think it's really simple about who gets to claim you as a dependent. I mean, even when I worked in large CPA firms, the basic question was, well, did your folks claim you? No? Well, good. Then we can claim you. That's not what the law says. Okay. Now, maybe nothing ever really comes about it until maybe dad gets audited, right? Or the son gets audited or something, and then they may find, whoops, we did something wrong. So this is a way you could document your answers too. So here are some exercises. So right now I want you to hit pause and read this and pull up your 4012. I'm going to give you the answer in a second when you restart the video, but pause this. Bob is 27 years old. His gross income was $17,000. Does he have to pay? Is he required to file a tax return? Yes or no? And the answer is yes. Why? Because if you go look on that chart A1, right, you can see he's 27, he's single. His standard deduction is going to be $14,600, so he's going to owe tax on $2,400. Here's another one. Janet and Harriet are married, usually file jointly. During the tax year, he turned 66, or she turned 66, he turned 64. Remember, there's that age thing in there? Go look on that chart A1. Their gross income was $28,800. Based on this, are they required to file a tax return? Hit pause, look it up in your 4012. And the answer is no, because their income didn't exceed that threshold. Here's another one. Juanita's got a dependent child and can file as qualifying widow. That's one of those actually, we should change this because I think we've stopped using widow, or I can't remember the term we're using, but someone decided it wasn't politically correct to do this. Okay. And my mind escapes me what the term we're using now, but same thing. Okay. She's 47. Her gross income was 30,000. Is she required to file a return? Hit pause, look up on the 4012. You're going to use that 4012 a lot. So start getting used to it. Okay. And the answer is yes. She has to file a return. One more. Trudy, 66, qualifies for head of household, had 19,900 of income. She required to file a return? Hit pause, go look in your 4012. And the answer is no, she doesn't have to file a return. Now, she may want to. We would encourage her to, but okay. Oh, we got one more. Melvin is 20, single, has a social security number. During the interview, you learned that his only income was $14,750 in wages. He lived with his parents all year, but they will not claim him on their return. Is he required to file? And here's a hint. Go look at chart B. So hit pause, go look at chart B. And actually we find yes, because if he was being claimed as a dependent on his parents' return, he made more money. Okay. So here's the screen where we elect filing status. And we're going to start talking about filing status now and explain these different statuses. Okay. You've seen the screen before. Right after you enter in a social security number to create a return in TaxSlayer, it brings you to this screen. What's the filing status? There is a wizard here. I've never really used it. I prefer to want to make sure that this is correct. I'm sure it works, and go ahead and play with it if you like. But so this is, where do you find the filing status? It's right on the top of the tax return, right up in here. These are the check boxes. And the quality reviewer should review this, because I found some that where they really would qualify for head of household and somebody marked them single. So again, this is a reminder here that married filing separate is out of scope. That should never be checked. So how do you determine filing status? There's a couple of different ways, okay? In your 4012, under tab B, there's interview tips. And in this interview, there's two ways. I'm going to show you a flow chart in the minute too. But using this interview, you just kind of, you can ask them these questions, and the first thing it's going to say, were you married on December 31st? Gives you a lot of information about you're considered unmarried if you were legally separated, meaning you had a court declaration, right? It gives you a lot of other stuff. It talks about partnership or civil unions. By the way, Arizona does not recognize common law marriages. Okay, so that's not it. But then it says if their answer is yes, go to step 2. In other words, they say, yeah, I was married. Okay. If they say no, I wasn't married, go to step 4. Oh, you got to ask something else. Did your spouse die? And actually, this would be in the last 2 years. Did they die in 23 or 24? Okay. If yes, go to step 5, and then you've got to ask all these questions here. And then eventually you get down to where you determine whether what their filing status. For instance, I'll go back here to the top, and they say, yes, I was married. Go to step 2. Do you and your spouse wish to file a joint return? Now remember, they could do married filing separate, but then we're not going to do the return. But if they say yes, here, it determines your filing status. You go down, if you were led to step 3, and you answer yes to all those questions, here, your filing status is head of household. Here's another way that you could do it. And this is, again, on tab B, I think the second page. I kind of prefer this chart, this decision tree, right? And you just start right up here at the left. Were you married? Yes. Then it said, did you and your spouse live apart all of the last 6 months of the year? Because this is more common than you would believe. People get separated and they think they're single, but they're probably not. In fact, well, they're definitely not single, okay? Period. They're not, okay? But here it says, did you live apart from your spouse all year? Yes. But now you got to answer all of these questions. And if all of these questions turn out to be yes, okay, let's look at them. You're filing a separate return. In other words, your spouse didn't file a married filing joint return, which, trust me, that happens too, okay? You paid more than half the house of keeping up your home for a required period of time. That's 6 months usually, okay? There's footnotes here. Always look at the footnotes. Your income is the main home of your child, stepchild, or foster child for more than half the year. That's the main thing right there, is they had to have kept up, the home for a dependent, and then you had to claim the child as a dependent. Okay. There may be a case where you give away that right to the other person, and then you wouldn't quite. If all of those are yes, then you get to be household. If they're no, right, you come back to here. Um, and then you would go back to where they're married filing separate and we can't do the return, or they have to do married filing jointly. Right? There's what it says right there. So this is the chart where you can determine those filing statuses. So here's another exercise. Alexandra's younger brother, Sebastian, is 17. He lived with his grandparents for the first 2 months of the year. Then from March through July, and now you got to get your fingers out and count the months, right? He lived with Alexandra. On August 1st, he moved in with some friends and stayed there for the rest of the year. Trust me, this isn't that uncommon, okay? Since Sebastian did not have a job, Alexandra gave him money every month. Assuming Alexandra had no other dependents, can she file as head of household? So you got to go back through that chart and answer all those things. So hit pause right now and go look at that chart and tell us whether they can file head of household. And the answer is no. For one thing, did Sebastian live with her for 6 months? Let's see, March, April, May, June, July. Now that's only 5 months, right? So that would disqualify her right there. Here's another example. Jane's husband moved out of their home in February and has not returned. Jane provides all of the cost of keeping up the home for herself and her 2 dependent children. Jane will not file a return with her joint return with her husband. What filing status should she use? Hit pause, go look at that chart or the interview tips, and tell me your answer. And the answer is head of household. Here's another one. Tanya's divorce became final in early September of the tax year. She's got sole custody of 3 kids who lived with her the entire year. They're all under age 17. She provided more than half of the cost of keeping up the home. Which filing status or statuses can she use? Careful here. So what'd you come up with? Head of household. Okay, Sydney's spouse died 2 years ago in January. He filed a joint return for that year as a surviving spouse. Oh, by the way, this was the term that you use. You don't use widower anymore. Surviving spouse is the correct term. So Sydney's spouse died 2 years ago in January. He filed a joint return for that year as a surviving spouse. Since then, Sydney has not remarried, maintains a home for his young children who lived with him all year, provides their sole support. So now go back to the Pub 4012, that chart A, and look at surviving spouse. What are all the rules for that? Hit pause, go look at that, and then come back and tell me your answer. And the answer is qualifying surviving spouse. Okay, a few more things and then we'll wrap up this section here. So what is an ITIN? An ITIN stands for an individual taxpayer identification number. And IRS issues these to help individuals comply with the US tax laws and to process tax returns and payments for those. This is really important. If they are eligible for a social security number, they cannot get an ITIN. They have to use their social security number. But sometimes people will be here temporarily. Maybe they're students studying, they're here legally, they're here, maybe they're working. They could be here as a student and working, so they should file a tax return. So then you would get IRS to issue an ITIN for them. Or, maybe they don't even live here. Maybe they're in China, but they've put a lot of money in bank accounts here and they earned a lot of interest. Well, the US says, hey, we want tax on that interest. And so then they've got to file a US tax return. But to file a return, they need a number. And of course, they can't get a social security number. So then they apply for an ITIN. Okay? An ITIN, it's a letter or a card that begins with the number 9. That's how you can tell it's an ITIN for sure. We can file returns, and careful with this. Most sites won't do this. Some sites will help them apply for an ITIN. The difficulty is it's kind of complicated. The taxpayer is going to have, first, it has to be a paper return. They're going to have to submit proof of their identity documents. And IRS says either you've got to send the originals, which is a bad idea. They're going to have to send their passport to Tennessee. Not a good idea. Okay. Or they have to get certified documents. Now they can get certified documents by going to IRS or to their consulate, or they can use something called a certified authentication agent. Some VITA sites have cert CAAs there. And so there's a few that can help them do that. I do this at my site at Scottsdale Community College, but there's not that many. So here are things, it's the ITINs used in place of a social security number. It doesn't entitle them to social security benefits or the earned income tax credit. We're going to learn that under credits, but that's going to get hammered into you. That somebody with an ITIN, or if there's an ITIN on the return almost, they're not getting an earned income tax credit, okay? It doesn't change their immigration status. It doesn't give them the right to work. It doesn't serve as an identification except in the tax system. That's the only thing it's good for. Okay. I just said this second. If a primary taxpayer, a spouse, or both have ITINs, they cannot receive not only the earned income tax credit, yeah, right, just the earned income tax credit, even if their dependents have a valid social security number. You think, well, geez, why not? But it's just the rule. Okay. And even if they both have social security numbers, but the dependents have ITINs, they don't get the EITC. So a minute ago I told you, if there's an ITIN on the return, there's no earned income tax credit, period. So the ITIN gets submitted with Form W7, and you can do these within TaxSlayer. But again, if you're a new tax preparer, you need to get somebody to help you with this too, okay? I've already kind of talked about the documents that you need, and there's a lot of them, and where you can get those accepted, so I'll skip this slide here. I've already kind of talked to it. I already described what a certified acceptance agent. See, they can certify copies of the documents that then get mailed in. A lot of them charge money for it. I don't at my site, so I mean, I sometimes help people, okay? Okay, that's going to end here. I'll pick up the next section with dependents. But for now, that's going to end session 2A. So we'll see you when you come back. Please take that intake in an interview and quality review exam if you haven't taken that. Let's keep moving on this so we make sure we get you certified by the end of these sessions. Okay? Bye-bye now.